I was so busy surviving that I never asked what I truly wanted. For a long time, I did not think that was a problem. I thought survival was the job. I thought adulthood was mostly about handling what was in front of you, getting through the day, meeting responsibilities, keeping things from falling apart, staying useful, staying needed, staying dependable. I thought if I kept moving, kept managing, kept adjusting, kept enduring, then one day there would be space to ask deeper questions. One day there would be room to breathe. One day life would slow down enough for me to think about what I wanted, who I was becoming, and whether the life I was living actually felt like mine. But that day never came on its own. And that is the danger of survival mode. It feels temporary while it is becoming your identity. I lived in survival mode for years, maybe longer than I even realized. It was there in the way I woke up already tense, in the way my mind immediately began sorting problems before my feet touched the floor, in the way I lived from task to task, need to need, obligation to obligation, without ever feeling fully inside my own life. I was not lazy, I was not careless, I was doing a lot. That is part of why it took me so long to understand what was happening. When a woman is constantly busy, constantly needed, constantly solving, constantly giving, people assume she is living a full life. But a full life and a consumed life are not the same thing. I had become consumed. The thing about survival mode is that it narrows you. It trains your attention on the urgent. What has to be done? What cannot be missed? What will go wrong if you stop carrying it? That way of living can be necessary for a season. Sometimes life really is that demanding. Sometimes a person does have to dig in and just get through. But when the season becomes the system, something inside you starts fading, not loudly, quietly. Your curiosity fades. Your imagination fades. Your ability to want without guilt fades. Your capacity to hear your own deeper needs fades. You become very efficient at coping and very distant from your own inner life. That was me. I could cope with almost anything. I could adjust, rework the day, carry the extra thing, absorb the emotion in the room, stretch money, stretch time, stretch patience, stretch myself. I became proud of that in some ways, proud that I could function under pressure, proud that I was the one people relied on, proud that I could keep everything moving even when I felt tired, unseen, or emotionally thin. But I understand now that survival skills, when overused, can become a cage. They make you strong in ways that slowly disconnect you from softness, vision, and desire. They keep you alive, but not always awake. I think one of the saddest parts is how socially acceptable this kind of life is for women. A woman who is always handling things is praised. A woman who puts everyone first is respected. A woman who rarely stops, rarely asks for much, rarely centers herself, is often called strong, selfless, dependable, admirable. I heard words like that too, and because those words sounded like love, I did not question them enough. I did not ask whether the life they were describing was also starving me. I did not ask whether being admired for endurance was costing me the chance to know myself more deeply. I did not ask whether my strength had become so functional that nobody, including me, was noticing how much of me had gone missing inside it. I used to believe that wanting more from life was a luxury, that asking myself what I truly wanted belonged to people with more time, more money, fewer responsibilities, fewer children, less pressure, less real life. I thought it was almost indulgent to sit still and ask, what do I want? What feels true to me? What kind of life would actually feel aligned? Those questions seemed too soft for the kind of life I was living. I had meals to make, bills to think about, schedules to manage, people to care for, emotions to absorb, problems to solve. Life did not seem interested in what I wanted. So eventually, I stopped asking. That is how a person goes missing without physically leaving. You stop asking the questions that would keep you connected to yourself. At first, it feels practical. Then it becomes habitual. Then it becomes identity. You become the woman who just does what needs to be done. The woman who doesn't really think about herself much. The woman who isn't picky. The woman who can handle a lot. But beneath those descriptions, there may be a quieter truth. You have spent so long in response mode that you no longer know what a self-directed life would even feel like. I remember moments when this truth brushed against me, but I pushed it away. A quiet evening after everyone else had gone to bed. A drive alone. A morning when the light in the room felt soft and I should have felt grateful, but instead I felt strangely absent from my own life. There would be a tiny opening, just a few seconds, where some deeper part of me would ask, "Is this really it?" Not in a dramatic, ungrateful way. In a more heartbreaking way. Is this all I'm allowed to be? A manager of needs? A responder to problems? A keeper of order? A holder of everyone else's world? And then almost immediately, the feeling would get buried again under practical life. Because practical life is loud. It does not give much space to vague emotional truths unless you protect that space intentionally, and I did not protect it. I kept living as though surviving was enough. I kept telling myself that peace would come later, that clarity would come later, that desire would come later. But the truth is, what comes later for many women is not sudden freedom. It is accumulated fatigue. It is decades of adaptation. It is a life that looks respectable from the outside, but feels strangely underlived from the inside. I think survival mode also changes the way you make decisions. You stop choosing from desire and start choosing from urgency. You stop asking what leads to life and start asking what keeps things from getting worse. You become conservative with yourself, not always with money or logistics, but with your own soul. You stop reaching for what is expansive because expansive things feel risky when you are already tired. So you keep the life you know how to manage, even if it is no longer nourishing you. You keep choosing what is familiar, what is expected, what is functional. And because those choices look reasonable, no one recognizes them as quiet surrender. That surrender shows up in small ways. You stop dressing for joy and start dressing for efficiency. You stop spending time on what feeds you because there is always something more urgent. You stop imagining change because even thinking about change feels like one more demand. You stop exploring your gifts because gifts require energy and all your energy is already allocated. You stop being playful, curious, creative. Not because those parts of you died, but because survival mode does not know what to do with them. It files them under later, and later becomes a graveyard. I had things in me I did not tend, interests I kept postponing, parts of my personality that only came out in brief, half-forgotten flashes. There was a lighter version of me once, a more curious one, a more inwardly alive one. But survival mode does not reward inward aliveness. It rewards speed, endurance, flexibility, usefulness. So those became my dominant traits. And over time, I became known for how well I handled life, not for how fully I inhabited it. That difference matters more than people think. The more years that passed, the more I started feeling a kind of emptiness that I could not explain with tiredness alone. It was not only that I needed rest, I needed direction, I needed room, I needed a relationship with myself that was not based solely on functionality. But because I had gone so long without asking those questions, I did not know how to enter them cleanly. When someone spends years in survival, Desire starts to feel blurry. The muscles of preference weaken. You ask, "What do I want?" And the answer does not come quickly, not because there is nothing there, but because there are too many layers of duty covering it. That frightened me, not all at once, but gradually. I began realizing that I could tell you what everyone around me needed with frightening precision, but I struggled to tell you what I myself truly wanted. I could tell you what was practical, responsible, realistic, affordable, expected, appropriate, but ask me what felt alive, what I longed for, what kind of day made me feel most like myself, and suddenly I was uncertain. That is not a small loss. That is what happens when a person has been useful for too long without being intimate enough with her own life. I also began noticing how often I felt guilty when I did try to move toward myself. If I rested, I felt behind. If I wanted time alone, I felt selfish. If I imagined a change, I immediately calculated what it would cost other people. If I wanted more, I first asked whether wanting more was fair. Survival mode trains you to negotiate against yourself automatically. It teaches you to weigh your own needs against everyone else's comfort until your own desires feel illegitimate before they even fully form. That is not humility. It is distortion. But I did not know that for a long time. I thought being good meant being last. I thought maturity meant being realistic about what life asks from women. I thought self-sacrifice was simply the honest shape of love. There is truth in sacrifice, yes. Love costs us something. Family costs us something. Commitment costs us something. But when sacrifice becomes so constant that you no longer remember what your own inner life sounds like, it has crossed from virtue into self-erasure. One of the hardest realizations of my life was understanding that survival mode was not only protecting me, it was also preventing me from becoming. It protected me from collapse, yes. It helped me carry real seasons that required strength, yes. But it also kept me from asking questions that would have changed everything if I had asked them sooner. Do I want this life, or have I simply become good at enduring it? What do I keep calling responsibility that is actually fear of change? What have I accepted as normal that is slowly emptying me? What would I choose if I believed my life was meant to be lived, not merely managed? Those are dangerous questions if you have built your whole identity around being the woman who handles what is in front of her. Because those questions do not let you stay in autopilot. They force you to notice where your life has become all reaction and almost no authorship. And authorship is what survival mode quietly steals. You may still be making decisions, but they are mostly reactive decisions, not deeply chosen ones. The urgent decides, the loud decides, the necessary decides. And eventually you wake up and realize you have spent years being needed without being truly guided by your own soul. I remember the first time I asked myself honestly what I wanted and did not immediately edit the answer. It felt almost disorienting, not because the answer was huge or dramatic, because it was mine, because it came from below all the conditioning, below the role, below the caretaking, below the habit of immediate self-correction. It felt like hearing a voice I had not listened to in years, and that moment was both beautiful and devastating. Beautiful because something inside me was still alive. Devastating because I realized how long I had left her waiting. I wish I could tell you the rest of the story became simple from there. It didn't. Once you have built a life around surviving, shifting toward truth feels risky. It can make you feel selfish, ungrateful, disruptive. It may confuse people who benefited from your endless availability. It may disappoint people who loved the version of you that never took up much space. It may force you to look directly at how much of your life has been shaped by coping rather than choosing. That is painful. but it is also clean. And I would choose that pain now over the slow suffocation of continued self-abandonment. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell her this: surviving is not the same as living, and usefulness is not the same as selfhood. I would tell her that she is allowed to ask what she wants before she is completely exhausted. I would tell her that wanting is not selfish, that rest is not weakness, that being deeply responsible does not require being permanently absent from herself. I would tell her not to wait for a breakdown to start taking her own life seriously. I would tell her not to build a life so full of responsibilities that her own inner world becomes a stranger to her. I would tell her that if she does not deliberately create space for truth, the urgent will happily occupy everything. I would also tell her that she does not need permission to become visible inside her own life. She does not need a crisis to justify change. She does not need total collapse to earn rest. She does not need every external condition to improve before she begins asking better questions. Some of the most important shifts in a life begin not with dramatic action, but with an honest pause. A pause long enough to ask, what am I actually building here? A pause long enough to notice whether the life I am maintaining is also the life I would choose if fear and duty were not speaking so loudly. I was so busy surviving that I never asked what I truly wanted. That sentence hurts because it tells the truth about years I cannot get back. But maybe it can save someone else. If that someone is you, then stop, even for a moment, and ask yourself the question I postponed for too long. Beneath all the duty, all the coping, all the carrying, all the useful things you do, what do you truly want? Not what is practical, not what is expected, not what causes the least disruption. What do you want? You deserve at least enough silence to hear the answer before your whole life is built without it.